Okay, look, let's start into it. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our meeting today. We're running a webinar about the foot and mouth disease agricultural agreement and for response and readiness. My name is Tom Orchiston, and thank you for joining us today to talk about the foot and mouth disease agreement. As you may know, there's currently a levy payer vote underway. We're about halfway through the time that's available for that, and that vote will close on the 16th of May. Today we've got our speakers, Nikki Hislop, who's a farmer director for the Central South Island for Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and we've also got Dave Harrison, who's the general manager for policy and advocacy. I'm just going to quickly run through. We're using Zoom today, and look, you can see on your screen there, I've got a little red circle around the Q&A function. So look, if you can use that question and answer function today to ask any questions that you might have, and we're going to have a good amount of time after Nikki and Dave have had a chat and work through some of those questions if you've got them. So if you're having trouble bringing up that question and answer thing, you'll find it on your Zoom toolbar, which is sort of at the bottom of the screen. You might need to hover your cursor over the Zoom screen to bring that up. If you don't see the Q&A, it's possibly under the More function. And if for some reason you're having any difficulties, if you're on a phone or something like that, you might just have to scroll across. Also in the chat, you can see the chat there. Look, we won't be using the chat for the questions today. You are able to pop some things in there if you want to, but you'll see there's a website for more information should you want to find out anything more, and that's the same address that's up on the screen at the moment, beef+lambnewzealand.com/FMD-vote. You can also put that into the Beef and Lamb website, and if you use the search function and use FMD vote, and it should bring it up as well. Look, you can ask questions at any time, but we will probably try and come back to those after Dave and Nikki have had a chat. And look, if you've got any problems here, feel free to message me directly through the chat function, or perhaps through the question and answer function as well. Look, I'm going to hold fire there, and I'm going to ask Nikki to bring herself up on screen and unmute, and I'm going to pass over to Nikki now, and she's going to run through some of the background to foot and mouth disease.
Thanks, Tom, and welcome everybody. Thank you for jumping on this call. As Tom said, look, I'm Farmer Director for Central South Island, and we are farming just out of Timaru. Look, I've been chatting away to a lot of farmers over the last couple of weeks about foot and mouth disease and this agreement, and I certainly know I'm not the only farmer who has a shared awareness and/or concern about foot and mouth disease should we have an outbreak. So it is just so important that we are really well prepared. And I guess recent outbreaks in Europe over the last couple of years have been a reminder to keep the possibility of an outbreak in mind. The priority certainly remains that we keep foot and mouth disease out of New Zealand, and Beef and Lamb New Zealand will certainly continue to hold the government and our border agencies to account because of the significant impact this disease could have. However, the agreement we're talking about today is about ensuring we can respond as quickly as possible in the unlikely event that it does arrive and minimise the damage to our sector and our economy. Next page, please, Tom. In the unlikely event that foot and mouth disease does reach our shores in New Zealand, our trading partners would immediately stop importing our products. The Institute of Economic Research has estimated that the cost to the country between $8.4 and $15.4 billion. So it's really significant, and it would be just simply devastating to our economy. The effort involved in a response would be enormous, and it's hugely important that we as farmers have a direct voice in key issues, such as we need to know how it would be resourced and we need to make sure that what's set up will work on the ground. And that's some of which we are going to go through with you today. We also want to have confidence that money will be spent in the right places and in a way that minimises impact on us as farmers. The Beef and Lamb Board has considered our options, and we believe that signing the foot and mouth disease operational agreement is the best thing to do for us as farmers. That's why we're recommending farmers vote in support of joining this agreement. However, it's up to farmers to have the final say. So this is your vote, and today is your opportunity to ask questions. So look, I'll now hand you over to Dave to talk in a little bit more detail about the agreement. But look, I just really want to highlight this is super important, and by all means really encourage others to vote also. Dave, over to you.
Right, thank you, Nikki. Yeah, and look, thank you all for taking the time to spend your lunch hour listening to Nikki and myself talk about foot and mouth disease and our readiness and response approach. As Nikki says, foot and mouth disease is like effectively the #1 biosecurity concern for the pastoral sector. So it should come as no surprise that where we are today is the results of many years of decades really of preparation and planning and constantly evolving how we deal with that particular threat. One thing that has changed in recent years, and particularly over the past 15 years, is how the government and industry work together on biosecurity. And so there is now a government industry agreement for biosecurity readiness and response, which we went out to farmers seeking their support to join in 2017, and had in excess of 85% of farmer support to join it. And the basis of that agreement is that the government is keen to manage its biosecurity expectations from industry, and so is asking for industry funding to responses to effectively show how important it is. But in exchange for that, you have industry playing a role as an equal decision maker in terms of how the responses run and or how we prepare for a response. And the real benefit to that is that oftentimes government may be well-meaning in terms of how it wants to deliver upon a response, but doesn't necessarily have feedback from on the ground in terms of the impacts of farmers and effectiveness of farmers. So there's a little bit of a win there in terms of ensuring that responses are effective while also minimizing the impact on farmers. And so that was the arrangement that we used for Mycoplasma bovis. In fairness, Mycoplasma bovis, there were I'm going to call them teething issues because we entered into this response into Mycoplasma bovis at effectively the same time as we started to get our heads around what industry and government working together and deciding together how to run a response was run. So there was definitely a learning experience, certainly in the early days of Mycoplasma bovis. But as the response evolved, I think the impact upon farmers and certainly the effectiveness of the response, which is we are now looking at that being successful. We're into a surveillance phase. Only benefited from having industry and government working together and from having all of those different perspectives forming part of actual decision making and not consultation. Next slide, please. So in terms of this particular agreement, as I say, it would fit under that broad approach of cost sharing for decision making rights. And foot and mouth disease obviously affects more than just sheep and beef farmers. It affects the dairy it affects dairy farmers. It affects dairy processors, dairy producers, the pork industry, etc., etc. So effectively, this agreement has been negotiated by all of the sectors that are going to be directly impacted upon foot and mouth disease in the unlikely event that it turned up in New Zealand. So this isn't just something that's being asked of Beef and Lamb New Zealand. And what the agreement does is it covers two things. It covers response, obviously, and if we, and so what is the plan in the event that we were to have FMD arrive in New Zealand? There's not it's not like we do not have a plan, but the plan needs to constantly evolve to deal with how threats change and how science changes and those sorts of things. So a key part of probably, the main part of what this agreement will cover will be ongoing work to ensure that we're as well prepared as we could possibly be in the event of foot and mouth disease arrival. But the agreement would also cover, like in the event that foot and mouth disease were to make its way to New Zealand, decision making on how you do it. So decision making on how we roll out the governance for things like compensation, decision making on how effectively just how we operate and how we control operations, and as without kind of labouring the point, I think there's real value in terms of having industry and farmer input into how we run these responses to ensure that they're A, effective, and B, cause as little harm as possible. Next slide, please. So the reason why, so all of these, as I've said, there's a lot of sectors that are are being asked to sign up to this agreement and that have negotiated the agreement. The reason why we are having a farmer vote is because of the way that we are set up. So Beef and Lamb New Zealand is a company. And in the worst case scenario of foot and mouth disease arriving in New Zealand and it costing the response cost $3 billion to undertake, sheep and beef farmers would have a liability or a potential liability of $90 million, which is far and away above the assets of Beef and Lamb New Zealand. And for us to be able to engage in this, legally, we need to have support from farmers as proxy for shareholders, but morally too as well. It's actually a really big liability, and so I can't speak necessarily on behalf of the board, but I sort of am. Is that we wouldn't want to commit to that level of liability unless farmers saw the value in it. We don't want to be providing a millstone around farmers' necks that they don't support. Other sector groups will have different ways of working through it, and they'll be going through their individual processes. Next slide, please. So what is our responsibility under the agreement would be two things. Would be to undertake readiness activity, which is, on the whole, readiness activities is laboratory supplies, to be honest. To start with, the way that we would approach an eradication of FMD would be, national shutdown in terms of livestock, but then looking to vaccinate around where the sources of infection are, to create a buffer zone, and then those vaccinated animals could be slaughtered over time rather than needing to have scenes like we've seen in responses in the likes of the UK in the early 2000s. That strategy relies on having access to vaccines. That strategy relies on having access to laboratory testing products and whatnot. So there is a level of actually having and I guess this is a lesson from COVID, right? Is like we need to have access to the vaccinations, access to the testing materials within the country to at least enable 4 weeks of a response, and then we can kind of look to bring in after that. So anyway, the point is, key part of readiness is actually having stuff there so that if the balloon went up, you're ready to go within hours rather than waiting for stuff to come. The other part of that is, look, just as I've mentioned before, is just ongoing refining how we think about foot and mouth disease, how we think about how it might get into New Zealand, building networks to enable not just foot and mouth disease to be dealt with effectively, but also providing some benefits in terms of just generally how diseases that impact upon the pastoral sector and having a network for facilitating response. So that's it on the readiness side. On the response side, look, the expectation, as I've said, is that I'll talk about the way this is split in a little while, but the expectation is that, look, industry would contribute a bit, but in contributing, industry becomes an equal partner in terms of decision making, and so has an absolute legally binding way to make decisions in the same way as the Crown does, rather than being consulted and the government going and deciding what it wants to do based on consultation. Next slide, please. So yeah, I've talked about a key part of this being how you share things between industry and government, and there are two tiers to this. So what the agreement is proposing is that the government would pay 60% of all of the readiness costs. So 60% of the costs of having the vaccines there, the lab tests there, and the time to ensure that we are as prepared as we can be under our planning. And industry collectively would pay 40%, and that would be split amongst industries, as I'll explain later. In the event of a response, the government will pick up a much greater share. That reflects the fact that it is actually a big deal for the New Zealand economy if we were to have FMD. And like, it is going to cost more than individual sectors can absorb to be able to manage this, and at the same time it's going to deliver benefits much more broadly than the pastoral sectors. Next slide, please. So within those cost shares, so within, like, industry would pay 40% for readiness cost and pay 15% for response costs. That would be divided amongst industries effectively based upon their relative size, their relative value. And so that 40% gets divided in rough terms, given the size of sheep and beef farming as it is in terms of its dollar value and what it contributes to the economy, we would be paying 20% of that 40%. That would change over time, and so if sheep and beef farming became massive compared to all of the other sectors, then we would pay more. If sheep and beef farming were to decline relative to other sectors, we would pay less. That would be something that would change over time, but at current state of play, we are talking about sheep and beef farming paying about 20% of the 40% of response costs, or 15% of 40% of readiness costs, I'm sorry, or 15% of response costs. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the readiness impact, so I've said that industry would be liable for 40% of that. For the industry is set up in 5-year tranches, and for the first 5 years, we have money to pay for what the sheep and beef sector would need to contribute for readiness. In rough terms, we are talking $150,000 a year is what the sector would need to contribute to having those laboratory stocks, the vaccinations, etc. And we are able to cover that without making any call upon farmers whatsoever. And so part of that is because we have some reserves left over from Mycoplasma bovis that we can draw upon to help support that. But we also have agreement in principle for the New Zealand Meat Board to contribute funding to this as an industry good activity. So to be absolutely clear, for the first 5 years of this agreement, at least, and assuming we do not get foot and mouth disease, there will be zero cost to farmers for our participation in this, or sheep and beef farmers anyway. Next slide, please. Look, in the unlikely event of a response, yep, we would need to look to recover costs. And there are two issues here. If there is a response, then the government will come in and front end all of the costs, and sheep and beef farmers would not have to pay back until at least 1 year of effectively normal trading had resumed. So it's not like the government would be looking for us to be contributing funding while we're being decimated by the impacts of a response. It's only as we start to recover that the government would be seeking this, and the government would be seeking a 10-year repayment period. And so in broad terms, if we had a $3 billion response or above, what that would mean for the sheep and beef sector, by the time you divided that to 15% industry, 20% of industry is beef and lamb New Zealand, it's around $90 million, which would need to be repaid over 10 years. And so that is that's a key contingency here. An issue there is that our beef levies under our biosecurity levy that we've had and that we've used to fund bovis will enable us to repay that within that time period. Not a problem. But under that same levy, we set our sheep meat levy for biosecurity responses at just 5 cents a head. And realistically, if we're going to be able to repay, assuming sheep pays for half of $90 million, if we were to repay that within 10 years, 5 cents a head is not going to cut it. And so another part of what we're proposing to farmers here is that we increase that levy to not increase the levy, but increase the maximum rate of levy to 30 cents a head. And so in the event that we had FMD, and only in the event that we had FMD, would there be the ability to recover from sheep at a rate of 30 cents a head to repay our obligations over 10 years. Next slide, please. So what is a yes vote? If you vote yes, you're voting for Beef and Lamb New Zealand signing up to this agreement alongside the dairy sector, alongside the meat processing sector, alongside the deer sector and the pigs, etc. As I say, if you say yes, we will not be looking for any money in terms of readiness for the next 5 years. We'll be using existing funds to be able to do that, and so there is no financial cost. But what we will need to do is adjust the potential ceiling of our biosecurity levy from 5 cents a head for sheep to 30% a head for sheep, but only in the event of a foot and mouth disease outbreak. So beyond that, the levy ceiling would remain unchanged, and the levy would remain unchanged at being 0 cents per head as it is imposed. Next slide, please. And so why vote yes? Look, I've kind of covered this already, but in broad terms, we think that it is beneficial in terms of the effectiveness of a response, beneficial in terms of minimising the impact of a response upon farmers, for industry groups to be actively involved in making decisions and not just be talked to. So that is effectively what we're buying under this, for want of a better word. And look, as I've said earlier as well too, this is not just sheep and beef. This is the across the entire pastoral sector or across the entire affected sector, including pigs and whatnot. And so, assuming that all the other entities signed up, we think it's important that sheep and beef are represented because we're not necessarily the same as dairy, and we're not necessarily the same as pigs, and we have different issues. We have different farming systems, different farming structures, those sorts of things. And so we think it's really important for the sheep and beef voice to be represented. Next slide, please. And if farmers say no, well, if you guys say no, look, we can't sign the agreement. Legally, we need support from farmers to be able to do it because it's a major transaction. If we don't have support from farmers, we cannot sign. That's black and white. There's nothing we can do about that. If we are not part of the operational agreement, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will avoid costs. The government still has the ability to recover costs in the event of a response from parties that benefit from it. And sheep and beef would absolutely benefit from a response and would be of such a size that it's worth the government coming and recovering that amount from the sector. So the likely event is that we would still have to pay and but have effectively, be consulted rather than actually be a decision maker, and I've kind of talked about the pros and cons of that already. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, and look, this will be pretty much my last slide on this, is that, look, it is a vote. As I've said, look, if we need farmer support to do this, or if farmers don't support it, then, that's it. It's like the power is in the hands of farmers. You will have received your packs in the mail, which will have individual voting information around how you can you vote online. It is only online voting. That is the only way to do it. And so if you do not have your packs, please get in touch with us, and we'll be able to work with our service providers and make sure that you do have a chance to vote. Voting closes at 2 p.m. on Friday, the 16th of May. We will have a result fairly shortly after that, which we'll be announcing to farmers. But my main message here in response here is please vote. Right, it's really important for us. And really important for the sector to have a mandate on this as well. And so the more people that vote and that participate in this, the stronger a mandate it gives for however people vote on this. So, yeah, look, I've made the case for why I think it is a good idea to vote yes. But if there is a more important thing than voting yes, it is actually voting. And so I just really encourage everybody to participate in this and please vote, and encourage your neighbours to. And I believe that will be me, Tom, if we go to the next slide.
Yep, that is indeed that end of your section, Dave. So thank you very much for that, Dave and Nikki. Look, we're going to open it up for questions now. So yeah, just a reminder to use that question or Q&A function that is in at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. And look, we've got plenty of time for questions. So yeah, feel free to pop them in now. I've also actually just unmuted. Well, I've allowed you to unmute yourself and share your video. So if you do have a question, feel free to maybe pop your video on first, and then I'll see you've got your video on, and then we can ask a few questions that way. But look, there are a couple of there's a few questions coming in now, so that's good. Keep them coming in. That's great. So look, the first one here, Dave, this might be for you. In the event of a response, would I pay multiple levies if my farming business covers multiple sectors?
Yes. That is right, and the reason for that is because you know in the event of a response, there is an industry share of 15% that would be contributed to response up to a maximum of $450 million across all of industry. So there is a cap there as well too. And if a response became more expensive than $3 billion, then the Crown picks up all of the cost for that. Right, everything over and above, but in terms of splitting the industry costs, it is split amongst the sectors based on their value. So yes, you could end up paying multiple levies if you have pigs and dairy and sheep and beef because of the way that that total industry cost is split.
Great, thank you. Here's another one that's just come in. Is there a provision for reviewing the percentage of sector cost shares?
Yes, every year the way that the costs are shared between industry would be adjusted based upon their relative values and how that has moved over time. So for that, every year. In terms of the cost between industry and the Crown, no. But between industries, yes, that would happen every year.
Okay, there's another one here. How much, and this might be possibly for you, Nikki, how much are the readiness and preparation activities going to cost farmers?
Yeah, well, look, as Dave said earlier, in terms of whether we will see increased costs in terms of readiness, as farmers know, we will be absorbing those costs. I mean, there will be costs, and Dave talked about, up to about $150,000 Beef and Lamb New Zealand will be contributing to readiness, but those costs will be absorbed by our M-Bovis, in the first instance, our M-Bovis levy for biosecurity, and then the New Zealand Meat Board through its industry good funding. So for readiness costs, there will not be a cost to farmers.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. There's another one here, a comment. This is more of a comment, and I'll just read it out. The galling part about this is if we don't sign up and we don't have a say in the decision making, it feels a bit like coercion by the government. Farming industry bodies should automatically have a say in decision making, because unless we're all working together, it will be very difficult to respond. So Dave or Nikki, do you want to maybe give a little quick comment on that?
Yeah. Look, it's completely valid, right? Is that the effectiveness of response does depend on industry involvement. One thing I would say is that look, this isn't unique to FMD. This is the same sort of structure and the same expectations that are put upon the plant sector for fruit fly or for brown mum-red stink bug, the same things that would apply to the aquaculture sector, etc. And look, in the government rationale for this is that if industry doesn't have skin in the game, it'll ask for the earth in terms of biosecurity responses and want to respond to everything. By having a little bit of skin in the game from industry, the government view is that kind of moderates, right? And you only ask for things that are really important. So it is it's a fair point that actually to be effective, every response needs industry involvement, and industry shouldn't have to pay. The reason for the paying is really about Treasury managing expectations from New Zealand around what are expected in terms of biosecurity responses.
Great, thanks, Dave. And look, I'll just give everyone a bit of a reminder. Yeah, feel free to fire some questions in. And look, if you do want to ask your question yourself to Dave or Nikki, just pop your video on. You should be able to do that now. And yeah, we can get you to ask your question directly. There's another one that's just come in. If there is a disease, if this disease is so critical to New Zealand, is the industry satisfied the government is spending and doing enough on the pre-readiness stage to prevent arrival? If not, can that be influenced?
actually, I better not say yes or no, because that could go either way depending on how the question was framed. We can absolutely have influence in terms of New Zealand's readiness and in terms of what the government does in terms of pre-border and at the border, etc., by participating in this agreement. So this gives us decision-making rights around, around how we are prepared. The other thing that it does give is, and this is sort of getting into a little bit more detail on the agreement, is in order for us to have this transaction of decision-making rights for a wee bit of cash, there is an expectation that alongside this, there are minimum commitments that are made by all of the parties. And a key one for the Crown is there is a minimum commitment that in order for, that actually everything is null and void and we don't have to pay anything if the Crown doesn't meet its commitment in terms of having a strong enough border, having robust risk assessments for imported products and those sorts of things. So indirectly, it gives us quite a strong influence in terms of ensuring that the ways in which foot and mouth disease could enter New Zealand, and other diseases as well too, are being managed robustly.
Great, thank you. And look, just a reminder, if anyone wants to ask their question themselves, now's a good time to do that. There's another one here, Dave. Will our customers still want to buy our product, and what impact might that have on prices?
If we had FMD, our customers don't want to pay for our product, don't want to buy our product. If we have foot and mouth disease, like trade in our products will stop as we sort of deal with the response. It will free up over time, as and potentially we'd be able to have regions that were free of or declared free of foot and mouth disease through the World Organization for Animal Health, potentially the North Island, potentially the South Island, depending on how it goes. But if foot and mouth disease reaches New Zealand, people will stop buying our products like a brick wall, and until we can demonstrate freedom from it.
Okay, Nikki, any comment on that?
No, other than, look, what Dave's just outlined is the very reason why it's so important that we're prepared, and that, should we get it, that we can respond really well, and it's a coordinated approach, and we know exactly what we're up for. So I think all of that is an important reason why this agreement is important for farmers to vote and support.
Great, thanks, Nikki and Dave. Look, we're just about coming to the end of our questions. So if you have got any questions that you want to pop in, now is a good time to quickly get them into the chat, or you can feel free to turn your camera on if you would like to ask it yourself. So there's another one. The last question I've got here for now is interest charged on the amount that farmers owe the government?
Okay. That was interesting. That was a good point of negotiation, actually. And the answer is no. The government wanted to, and industry pushed back against it. And so, no, there would be no interest.
Okay, so that's essentially, it's a sort of a set amount, and that won't accumulate over
That's
time.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, well, look, I think we are at the end of the questions there. So if you do have a question, quickly jump on and ask it. Otherwise, look, I might just bring us to the end of this now. And look, I would like to thank, sorry, there's another one just popped in. I was just about to close it, but here we go. Can this highly contagious disease spread to feral pigs, deer, and goat populations?
Yes. Yeah, it can. And so that is why our strategy around managing the disease is effectively, the first suspicion that it's there is livestock stand still, nothing moves for quite a while until we work out where it is, if it is, because in New Zealand we've had a couple of false alarms, sometimes related to, if I remember rightly, it was eating sweets and gave lesions around the mouth back in Temuka. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting waylaid, but yes, like our strategy is to just lock all movements down to try and contain spread, and then contain the spread. Look, it can get into goats and into wild pigs and those sorts of things. The extent to which that's a risk is it's absolutely a risk, but it's potentially not as big as you might think, because it's quite hard to infect deer. Goats on the other hand, pigs will get infected but not stay infected for long, for want of a better word. So they're not likely to build up a big reservoir in the native in the wild population. But look, the long and the short of it is, it's absolutely a risk, and it's a risk we need to think about. It's a risk we need to manage, and it's a risk that we've got a bit of an understanding of and need to avoid.
Great, thanks, Dave. Look, another one's just popped in. What has been learned from the Bovis situation?
Truckloads and truckloads and truckloads. The difference between this and the Bovis situation is, the Bovis situation operated under the same rules, I suppose, in terms of, hey, look, it'll be cost shared and decision making and those sorts of things. But the real difference there was we were coming to grips with and working out how we were going to work together. There was no plan in place, etc., because it kind of came out of the blue. And it came out of the blue. We weren't prepared. We hadn't thought about it. We didn't have any thinking really around how we'd govern a response and whatnot. And so what is really different in terms of FMD is, we've learnt those lessons. We've learnt that actually, we scrambled around for 6 months in the first stages of Bovis before we built up the governance structure that you'd expect for an $870 million response, and so, we've learned from that, and now we've got a model that we can work to for a large scale response that is, effective governance, looking after costs, looking after health and safety, looking after all of these sorts of things. So that's been a massive learning, but there is also a massive learning, I guess, in terms of how the parties work together, because it was the first time that we had a decision-making right rather than just being consulted. And that takes a little bit of time for us to get our heads around, and particularly for the government to get their heads around, right? Where it isn't just the government's decision, it is jointly done. So there is a massive amount of learning in terms of Mycoplasma bovis. And Mycoplasma bovis, I've kind of alluded to, was a learning process because we weren't ready for it. And FMD, we can be ready for. We can take all of the stuff we've learned around minimising impact on farmers, process and compensation, response governance, etc., and plug that into our preparedness for FMD, and not just FMD, but anything else that affects the pastoral sector.
Great, thanks, Dave. Look, that's kind of brought us to the end of those questions. So appreciate both of you being available for that. Nikki, I'm just wondering, I might just pop back to you. Are there any sort of last comments you want to make around the voting that you might want to make a little comment there?
Yeah, well, look, as both Tom and Dave have alluded to, voting closes on the 16th of May. So look, it's really important. We want as good a turnout as we possibly can get. As farmers, we sometimes can be a little bit apathetic about this stuff, but it's just so important. So for those of you on the call today, look, if you are talking to your neighbours or talking to other farmers at various things over the next week, please encourage them to vote. We really do want as strong a mandate as we possibly can get. So, encourage others to vote. It's a really, it's a big concern we all have as farmers. Let's be as prepared as we possibly can.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Nikki. Really appreciate that. Look, I'm just going to draw your attention to on the screen at the moment. There's a QR code there. or there's a link in the chat. If you're able to provide us some feedback today, that would be really fantastic. It's really helpful to make sure we're improving our engagement and our delivery with farmers. Also on screen, you can see that if you want more information, and there's a whole bunch of FAQs and other information about voting and so on. That's through that link there, beef+lambnz.com/FMD-vote. And you can also use the search function on the Beef and Lamb and just search FMD-vote, and you'll also find your way to the information page there. But look, that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar today. I'd like to thank Nikki and Dave for their time and their presentations, and I'd also like to thank all our attendees today for attending, and really appreciate your time that you've given us today. So as Nikki said, yep, go out and vote and encourage others to vote. And yeah, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.